Brilliant. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going, as you know, to be talking about how coronavirus will affect graduate and early career recruitment. It's going to take about 30 minutes to get through the webinar today, and we're going to send through a recording afterwards, probably tomorrow or the day after. Any questions as we go, just chuck them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and answer them as we go. But if we can't, then we'll get to them at the end. So please do ask questions as we go. We're also going to be sending through a feedback form at the end of the webinar today. It's so useful when people fill them in. It really gives us an idea of what content people care about and want to hear about in the future. So please do take the time to do that. Ooh. So just to introduce our speakers today, I'm really happy to be joined today by Marielle Meer, who is the Executive Director of Partnerships and Global Networks at the London Interdisciplinary School. I'm going to call them LIS for the tongue twister and an interdisciplinary is. But LIS is a brand new university that's reapproaching the way that universities teach and the way that they approach education. As the name suggests, they favour an interdisciplinary approach to the world's increasingly complex problems. Marielle is responsible for building the university's employer network and developing its and implementing its career strategy. So she'll be talking through how COVID should and could change the subject matter that universities focus on. But before that, I'd like to take you through the effect that we think the crisis is going to have on the way that employers approach graduate recruitment, and the way and the opportunities and barriers that puts in their way. But let me start by introducing myself and Instant Impact more generally. So for those of you that don't know us already, Instant Impact is a talent partnership business specializing in building and running high-performing internal recruitment functions. I set up the business with my other founding director called Rob, and we set it up about 9 years ago to try and help companies address an area that many were struggling with, which is graduate recruitment. Since then, we've evolved Instant Impact to become expert at everything required to make an internal recruitment team fire on all cylinders. So everything from the strategy and the people, the marketing and technology required to deliver a high-performing recruitment function. But the early career recruitment is still a really big linchpin of what we do. Over those 9 years, we've run graduate recruitment intakes with some of the best-known employers in the world, like Apple, Aston Martin, Ipsos Mori, but we've also set up brand new programs for companies like Octopus Energy and Babylon Health. So for today's webinar, we're going to be drawing on all of that experience. It's over, I think, 3,000 graduate careers started in all, and also talking through some of the projects that we're running with our clients at the moment to plan for ways that talent will change over the coming weeks, months, and years. So I hardly need to point out that we're living through a time of unprecedented change. Graduate recruitment is going to be hard, far from exempt from this, and in some cases hit quite hard. So the key changes that we're expecting to see driving change here are the adoption of remote working, record levels of unemployment, and changing perspectives around inequality and diversity. So following the Black Lives Matter protests going on around the world, we're really expecting to see a change in the way that both the public and governments, their expectations of how companies approach inequality and diversity. So I'm going to go through how those areas will affect graduate programs and also to some extent apprenticeship programs as well. There's obviously a fair bit of doom and gloom going around at the moment, but I do want to emphasize that there's a lot of opportunity for those companies that are willing to take it. It's worth noting that many of the UK's graduate employers have either delayed or cancelled, in some cases, their graduate and internship programs. So maybe smaller or medium-sized companies that can react quickly to changes will be able to compete for a different class of talent than usual. And we're expecting to see a shift in the talent that companies want to employ, as well as how they go about targeting those audiences. So a move to remote working, we're expecting to result in increased competition for technical talent, well, that's hardly new, but we're expecting to see an already pretty wide tech skills gap to get even wider. So following high levels of tech adoption in even the most traditional of companies, that's going to drive an increased demand in everything from developers to cybersecurity experts. And universities were already struggling to keep pace with the demand for tech talent even before COVID. So it's actually, I find it quite tough to see how they're going to respond to that increase in demand, especially if you consider that the numbers of international students this year have plummeted. And we expect it to take a few years until those numbers return to their 2019 levels. That's likely to compound this technical skills gap even further, meaning that maybe employers will have to step into that gap and teach some of those tech skills rather than expecting them to come out of candidates from university. The other outcome of what I mentioned before in terms of talent that companies are going to be going for is companies are really going to be competing hard for diverse talent. One of the, there are going to be expectations, I think companies will be under the microscope on their strategies that they have to improve diversity, and grad and apprenticeship programs are one of the best ways for companies to build the roots of a diverse company. And I'm going to run through a few stats that show pretty clearly why. So this is a pretty shocking statistic, but in the UK, only 9.7% of executive positions in the FTSE 100 are filled by women. And you compare that talent pool to the talent pool of 57% of students currently at university are female. So, and that's pretty stark, but even more troubling, only 6% of top managerial positions are filled by BAME employees. And you compare that to 20% of students currently at university who identify as BAME. Consequently, we expect to see that companies that really want to make a big effect on the diversity will focus heavily on their early careers programs. So hopefully that means more companies entering the early career space and offering a wider range of opportunities to both grads and apprentices. And the final point to say here is that here around what talent companies are going for is that we're expecting the skills that companies are going for, that will change even beyond tech. But I know that Marielle is going to cover that in her presentation shortly. So the methods that companies use to attract talent are also going to change. So social distancing means no careers fairs, and no careers fairs means a lot of companies are going to have to think quite differently around how they attract talent. So this is a change that was already happening before, but we're expecting COVID to really fast track the digitalization of candidate attraction. So companies are going to turn to job boards, so either ones that are really university and campus specific, like Milkground, or more traditional ones like LinkedIn or Indeed. Companies are going to focus on working on their employer brands to make sure they're attractive to Gen Z. Now that's a whole webinar in itself, but certainly something to have a think about now. And then finally, companies are going to explore different ways of engaging with career services. So career services are already setting up virtual careers events, but there are other ways that you can engage with them already. So it differs from university to university, but you can send out mail shots or be put in touch with different lecturers, or some even introduce you directly to their students as candidates. But hopefully this is going to force them to become more and more creative this year and widen up the ways that we can engage with them. I also think that companies are going to have to make changes to attract diverse talent. So first of all, broadening the universities that they go to, that they target, no longer just Russell Group only, but looking at ones that have a more diverse student base. The good news is that that's much more easy to do digitally than going campus to campus. That you can also, I also imagine that societies are going to get more interest in companies wanting to partner with them. And finally, I think that companies should look at their employer brands as well and just make sure it's as inclusive as possible. The last point I wanted to make here is that the good news for employers, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is that there's going to be increased supply. So what we saw in 2008, when actually I was coming to the end of my own university career, is that there was a real net reduction in entry-level roles. And we expect that to be the same this year and next year. And that means that we'll see what we saw in 2008, probably through to 2012, which is that smaller and medium-sized companies without really established graduate employer brands will be able to compete for some talent that they usually wouldn't be able to compete for. And they'll see application numbers shooting through the roof. So another thing that companies should be thinking about right now is on creating scalable screening processes that take the burden away from senior hiring managers. And that leads me quite nicely onto the next point, which is assessment. So we've recently ran a full webinar on this, on remote recruitment and onboarding, and we'll circulate a link to that in our chat. But I thought it'd be useful to provide a quick overview on how companies should change their recruitment and assessment processes in response to COVID, just so that you have the information to hand now. So first of all, on process changes, try and keep what works. So I think a lot of companies have been really tempted to reinvent the wheel on this and change everything, but with video conferencing and cloud technology, you really can replicate a lot of your assessment process like for like over Zoom. Secondly, that one of the areas that's not easy to replicate is on selling the opportunity. It can be quite difficult to get a feel for the company without seeing the office. So think about other ways that you can do that. So whether you can get more people involved in the interview process, get them to meet more of the team, maybe include an informal chat there. If you have a video of the office, that can be really good just to get them a feel there. And then finally, the other thing to change is just to be really empathic. Everyone's still even 3 or 4 months in, getting used to the world of video meetings, video conferencing. And for the grads and students that you're interviewing, this may well be their first or second meeting over video. So just be empathic if they get that wrong. The other area that we'd really recommend companies look into at the moment is increasing the transparency of their assessment process. So we're expecting to see, of course, with more candidates come higher levels of rejection, but there have also recently been a move towards increased expectations around transparency. So if you think about GDPR as one example, and also our expectations around companies needing to focus on diversity, we're just expecting to see more companies having more transparency around reasons for accepting and rejecting candidates. So, and we're expecting candidates themselves to be more demanding in seeing evidence of why they were rejected or why they weren't moved forward from role to role. So there are some fantastic tools to help here. For example, we partner with a company called Applied, their diversity focused screening technology, and they help companies to remove high risk areas for unconscious bias or subjective thinking like CVs or unstructured interviews, and replacing them with things like work samples, psychometrics, and structured interviews that are not only better predictors of performance in jobs, but also come with scorecards and a little bit of objectivity. And a little bit of effort here can go quite a long way. And I'd really recommend that companies think about how to keep accurate records of candidate scoring. It only takes one subject access request to throw a real spanner in the works. So on assessment, there's one area that we've been asked about quite a bit, and I thought it would be good to go through here. It's the assessment center, which is core to quite a lot of businesses' graduate recruitment, but does present more challenges than other stages of the assessment process to run remotely. We found 2 ways for it to be effective and be run effectively. I suppose the first one's a bit of a cheat. It's to get rid of it and replace it with interviews, to expand your interviews or case studies to ensure that you assess the same skills that you were assessing in your group assessment, and do that in an interview setting instead. So for example, we worked with one of our clients that really indexes highly on entrepreneurial drive, and there was a group task that we used to get in groups, I think of 8, and come up with a business idea and put together a quick pitch for that. We broke that down, saw what skills it was looking for, so assessing problem solving under pressure and commercial creativity, and we just replaced that with a one-to-one interview, asking questions around solutions to specific problems. So that worked really well. The other is to go ahead and replicate that group assessment online, but there are some key points that we recommend considering. The first is how to put candidates at ease. Usually candidates get 10, 15, 20 minutes to meet each other in reception, get chatting, relax a little bit. Have a think around how to replicate that. Could you, for example, have 15 minutes at the beginning where there are no assessors and it's just candidates in the Zoom room having a chat, finding out a little bit more about each other, and just making it clear that representatives from your business will only join at a specified time. Another point is how you can ensure that everyone gets heard. We've all been on Zoom meetings, and everyone's sort of jumping in at different points, and it can be difficult to get a word in edgeways. So that's amplified when people are trying to impress you and when they're being assessed. So really consider breaking out into smaller groups, 3, 4, maybe 5 people as part of the assessment, so that everyone gets a chance to shine and chip in. And then finally, just think about the order of your day. So as I mentioned before, a lot of candidates might not have done a lot of Zoom meetings, and having a Zoom group assessment is quite complex. So having a think about if you could run your interviews and case studies early on, that would get them used to the medium, and then moving it into case studies could work better later. So if you've made your hire, I think there's still a lot of questions to ask around graduate schemes. As we all know, graduate programs can be very time and resource intensive. To get your recent grad into a fully functioning employee can take days of classroom training, peer mentors, pastoral care, the list goes on and on. So the advent of remote working will only complicate this and require those running programs to double down on planning and on resource planning as well. But as this stat from Josh Bursin at Deloitte shows, it's well worth the investment to get right. We all know that the first 40 days are real high risk in terms of candidates leaving the business before you want them to. 22%, in fact, of employees leave within their first 45 days. So what can you do about this? Well, I think the first thing is really be careful with planning out the logistics. In a world where much of your team is working from home, logistics become much more complex. So it's well illustrated if you think about the most simple of things, which is having technology up and running for your grads on day one. You can't simply go to the IT room and dig out a spare laptop. No, you need to purchase the computers, deliver them to IT to be configured, get all the software on them, courier that to your new starter, and that's all before assessing whether your new starter has home Wi-Fi that's secure and ready to go for the industry that you're in. So everything just becomes a much more time-consuming process. And as we said, I really don't think the world of remote working is one that's going to go away anytime soon. So it's worth investing this year in checklists, in planning in advance, and on making sure that you've got a day-by-day plan that starts from the start date, builds in room for delays, and this is definitely a case of fail to plan to fail, and you'll have all this set up for next year when you run your next intake, so that'll be well worth it. Thinking through training, again, it's a question around thinking everything out one more time for a remote working world. So really think about the areas that are going to change. So it might become harder to rotate graduates through different departments, as there's less of a physical divide, and it might take longer to learn a new skill set remotely. Graduates are less likely to have in-person exposure to peers and mentors, that sort of accidental exposure that you get. So it might mean that you need to be more planned around your shadowing and more planned around the exposure they get to senior or different people within the organization, and means that you'll be able to be less reliant on ad hoc elements of your training program. So for example, it's hard to see when trainees are at a loose end. So I'd recommend thinking about that in advance, providing them with work that they can do in their downtime and in between training, and obviously tell them to shout when they've got nothing to do. Also recommend keeping it interesting, mixing up the trainers, mixing up the training formats. If it is all going to be remote, or a lot of it's going to be remote, then variety is really going to help that training sink in. And one of the benefits of remote training is that it's easier to loop in more of the team, as a one hour or 30-minute Zoom training session is easy enough to slip into even the most busy executive schedule. And then finally, with training and onboarding remotely, because you're doing everything over Zoom, you can record the sessions, the trainee can watch it back, you can share it with other trainees, build up a real library of resource there. You might even be able to share it with people from outside of the business on your LinkedIn or something to build your employer brand. The last thing that you should be thinking about on training onboarding is on retention. So really recommend that think about how to make all of this fun and build in a social element to training and onboarding, because it's going to have a real direct effect on your retention. Grads and apprentices often make friends for life during their first jobs, and that can be a really big reason for staying in the role. So I read a stat that 58% would turn down a higher paying job if it meant not getting on with new co-workers. Don't leave this to chance. Set up a social or culture committee of your existing employees to codify how the current culture can be transferred to a remote working world and imparted to your new graduate class. It's much easier now to do now than it was 2 months ago. You can do elements in person, so coffees, drinks, lunches in people's gardens or in the park. Whatever it is, just make sure you schedule it, or else it's really unlikely to happen. So if anyone's interested in exploring any of this further, we're offering workshops throughout July to help our community to better understand and better prepare for a remote graduate intake. Anyone on today's webinar will be able to book one in for free. Just pop me an email at felix.mitchell@instant-impact.com. Again, I'll send it into chat or send me a message on LinkedIn. So thanks for listening. Now I'm going to hand over to our guest speaker, Marielle. Thank you so much for joining us, Marielle, and thanks for giving us the university perspective.
Thank you so much. Just before I share my screen, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me, Felix?
Oh, yeah, gotcha.
Perfect. Okay, let me just share my screen. There we go. There we go. You should be able to see my screen now. So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Marielle. As Felix mentioned, I am the Executive Director of Partnerships for LAS, which is a brand new university that technically doesn't even just exist yet. We are expecting to welcome our first cohort of students in September 2021. So the idea behind LAS, and I will talk a little bit about it later in the presentation as well, but is really to build a new university that is more relevant to today's changing world, to today's changing student needs and employer needs. And my personal background is that I have been in higher education for the last 15 years. I've worked for a lot of different traditional universities in different countries actually, and got increasingly frustrated with the traditional model of higher education. So for the last 6 years, I've actually been involved in setting up a number of different new universities. One was Minerva in San Francisco, and another one was the African Leadership University in Africa. So now I'm doing it a little bit closer to home, just here on my doorstep in London, which is really exciting. And I always say that it's probably easier to build a whole new university from scratch rather than to try and change something that already exists. But what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about COVID-19 as an example of a complex problem, and also look at some of the challenges that current universities and the current education system actually face in tackling complex problems in general. Want to talk a little bit about key trends that are driving transformation in education and also in the world of work. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about what universities can do to really help students prepare for graduate employability in these uncertain times. So I wanted to start with the proverbial "give a man a hammer and what does he see?" You probably know that expression quite well. If someone has a hammer, they're likely just to see a nail, and they will revert to that solution time and time again if they want to fix something, because they have the tool, and that's just a natural kind of reaction that people have to refer to what they know and to use tools and solutions that they're familiar with. There's actually a name name for that. It's called Einstellung, which is a German word. I think it derives from a German philosopher in 1942 or 1946, which essentially is exactly that. It's once you try and solve a problem in one particular way, you will use that method time and time again, even if different or better or additional solutions may be available. So in a way, what I'm seeing and what I think is that universities might be suffering from Einstellung and from the Einstellung effect a little bit in their responses to COVID-19. And not just in the response to COVID-19, probably in kind of many different ways, but I won't go there because that would be a whole different webinar and I can talk about it for hours. But if you think about it, obviously in the wake of COVID-19, universities had to really quickly adapt and pivot to using new different ways of delivering their teaching and moving their teaching to online platforms, which has been a great development. And I think in many ways there's a lot of good things to say about that. But what that doesn't look at is the way that it's not just about the delivery of classes. It's not just about using technology to actually deliver the same curriculum that you've been teaching offline. This is also a moment in which universities should really look at rethinking their curriculum as well, to see if the curriculum itself can be more relevant to today's changing world. Technology is often seen as a solution, so that's the hammer and the nail analogy, but technology, in my view, is a means to an end, and it's a very important means to an end, but there's a lot more surrounding the complex issues that we're facing with COVID-19 and other complex challenges. So COVID-19 is really an example of what we would call a complex problem. So complex problems, as in contrast to a complicated problems might be very difficult to solve, but they usually have one single solution. And if someone has the right tools and the right expertise and specialism to actually solve those problems, they are solvable. And the same solution is repeatable. So examples of a complicated problem would be things like rocket science or neurosurgery or fixing a Ferrari. So it's not that they're easy, but they're solvable. But a complex problem is actually a problem that has so many unknowns that there's no one way of solving that problem. So the problem can be managed, but the problem can't be solved. And often when solutions are found to certain aspects of the problem, whole new problems arise from it. So COVID-19 is a good example in that, as it's not just a healthcare problem, but there's implications on society, on economics, on politics, on the environment, etc. So just like problems like diversity, institutional racism, obesity, climate change, what complex problems have in common is that they span across different sectors, and as the world is changing rapidly, more and more problems are complex rather than complicated. So they span across sectors, they span across industries and disciplines and domains, and they really need different lenses to kind of be tackled and be looked at. And they also span across the world. So if problems look this way, the question is, why does our education system still look like this? Obviously, traditionally, our education system has really been designed and developed to narrow down and to increase specialist knowledge throughout the learning journey, to start quite broad, but then to end quite specific. And whilst that model was very relevant in the time when it was designed and when it was developed, the question is, how relevant is that model still now, and how challenging is this model if you try and use this model of education and try and solve some of those complex problems that we just talked about? That's a huge challenge. So here are a couple of, three trends that really transform education, and not just education, but also the world of work. So one of them is that knowledge these days is networked. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Dewey classification system of libraries, which is essentially where all kind of the way that we have organized information and knowledge has very much been based on library classification systems. So an example is back in the day when we would still go to libraries to do some studying, and we wanted to know something about, let's say, Irish folk music, we would go to social sciences, which would be category 100, and then Ireland category 100, 110, and then dancing 100, 110, 120, and then eventually you find what you need. Obviously now information is very much a click of the finger away, and information it's all what the internet is to information now is what the library used to be back in those days. So information is connected across disciplines and across areas. So it's more about being able to understand and analyze those connections and see those different ways of interactions between the information rather than absorbing information on its own. So that's one aspect that really kind of transforming the way that we think about education, because obviously that Dewey kind of library classification system is also an underlying framework for having knowledge organized in disciplines. So the second piece, and that's something that you are probably much more familiar with than I am, especially those of you on the call who are working in HR and recruitment, but that's the rise of hybrid jobs. I think, if you look at statistics, only about quarter of employers would look at a specific degree or would have a specific degree requirement when they're hiring graduates, and more and more jobs are actually hybrid roles that sit on the intersections between different specialisms, different fields of knowledge, and different subject areas. And there's not one degree or one program or one job that can actually really prepare students for the intersectionality of that. So what's really needed there is a way, is a development of systems thinking and making sure that students and employees are able to work across complex systems and across complex teams, and draw from expertise from different disciplines and different approaches. And then the final trend that I've put out there is a shift towards career security instead of job security. So the whole concept of a job for life, like perhaps our parents were still familiar with, doesn't exist anymore. So with that comes a real need for continuous and lifelong learning and the ability to be able to keep on learning and to relearn whilst you are already working. And I was reading through some research the other day that was done by, I think, LinkedIn, that looked at the probability of an employee progressing to a senior management or a senior executive role within a company is much higher if they've had experience in multiple functionalities rather than just having experience in years and years of, let's say, finance. So exposure to multiple functions and areas of expertise increases the chances to kind of grow and grow further into one's career. And also, I think that same research states that 3 years of multifunctional experience weighs as much as an MBA, having an MBA. So I think those are all kind of trends that we see anyway happening in the last years and even decades. And I think, we all know about the fourth industrial revolution and the effects that has on us. But I do think that those trends are much more accelerated and amplified now in times of COVID, and universities and employers are pivoting into, trying to kind of tackle those issues much more now. And there's much more of an urgency than there was before COVID. So I want to move on to kind of talk a little bit about what graduate employability should look like, or how universities and education institutions can actually prepare students for graduate employability in this post-COVID world. And this really ties into everything that Felix was talking about, obviously there is going to be high unemployment rates. The ISE research already shows that 25% or that employers are expected to hire 25% less graduates than they've done in the past years. So how do we really prepare students as a university and as an education institution? How do we prepare students to deal with that kind of uncertainty and to prepare them for jobs that may not exist yet? So I'm going to talk about 3 different strategies here, and I will use LAS as an example of how we envision of doing that. The first strategy is it's all about interdisciplinarity, the tongue twister, as Felix called it. And I'm a big fan of using proverbs, as you can see. Not normally, but it happened to be this presentation. Anyway, so there's you probably have heard of the proverb that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog only knows one thing, which is an ancient Greece proverb. And the idea behind it really is that the hedgehog will always outwin the fox. Like the fox might know a lot of different ways in trying to get and catch the hedgehog, but the moment that the hedgehog rolls up in a ball, then the fox has no chance to catch it. And traditionally, and this ties into what I talked about before when I talked about Einstein and complicated problems. Traditionally in academia, there's been a real appreciation for the hedgehog, as in we should educate people with very strong specialism in one particular field, and that makes them stronger in their fields. But as we have seen a shift in kind of like the problems that we're dealing with becoming more and more complex, there's also a shift in the need for more foxier thinking, so to speak, which is where interdisciplinarity comes in. And interdisciplinarity is really about finding looking at things through the synergy of different multiple disciplines. So we're not saying that disciplinary knowledge is obsolete or is not necessary. On the contrary, people need to have rigorous understanding of different disciplines, but what becomes more important is that they can find synergy between these different disciplines and apply that to the world that we're living in. So that's very much at the foundation of what we're doing at LAS. We're building a curriculum that is fully interdisciplinary and that focuses on problems. So every module that a student takes at LAS will be tackling one particular complex problem, let's say knife crime, and we'll tackle that from the perspective of multiple disciplines and also incorporating different methods to actually tackle these problems. So research methods, data science, qualitative methods, etc. So at the end of their degree program with us, students actually graduate with a BASC, so a Bachelor of Arts and Sciences, rather than a BA or a BSc. So, and by the way, that quote comes from a book called Range, which is by David Epstein. I could definitely recommend anyone who hasn't heard of that to read that, because it is really, really fascinating way of looking at, that shift in from hedgehogs to foxes and the need for generalist knowledge if applied well. So the second, and this is what Felix also referred to already a little bit, the second strategy that universities really need to think about is how can they help students develop or curate these skills that are increasingly needed in this uncertain world and in the post-COVID world. You probably all have seen this before. Part of this data comes from the WEF Future of Work report from 2018 and really looks at the skills that are needed in a fourth industrial revolution and consequences of that. And part of these skills come from research that Forbes did recently in the wake of COVID or during COVID. So I won't go over all of them. I'll leave this slide up for a bit, but some things that really stand out to me when I look at that are obviously it's not just about students having hard tech skills that are really important but that change all the time, but it's about students having tech savviness and being comfortable with using data and understanding data and not being shying away from it. But also, and that's point 12 there, the commitment to lifelong learning. So I think that becomes increasingly important, that students are able to continue to learn, and individuals and employees that they are able to continue to learn on the job in order to be successful. And then another couple of things that really stand out to me are skills such as resilience and flexibility and adaptability. I think no one really knows what will happen. We all know that complex problems will continue to exist, but what will happen in this world and how we will deal with it is something that is fairly unknown. So I think young students and young graduates are really facing a massive challenge with that, and that level of uncertainty that requires a strong level of resilience and flexibility and adaptability. And I think it is the responsibility of a university and as well as an employer to really make sure that we help students develop and curate those skills, both through the curriculum that is being offered and the curricular experience, as well as the extracurricular experiences and services that universities have. So I think there should be much more focus on that. So the last final point to make there is that the third kind of strategy that universities should develop is to really introduce much more porosity in their approaches to education, which I mean that education should not sit separate from the real world, so to say, but should really connect to it. So it's not just about breaking through those silos of disciplines that I just mentioned, but it's also about making sure that that isolation of academia versus practice and industry that's kind of broken through, and that those barriers are broken through, not just towards the end of a degree or not just at certain moments in the student journey, but continuously from very much the first day that students start studying. So one way of doing that is by using industry expertise to help inform the curriculum. So whilst at LAS, whilst the teaching is still very much done by our faculty and the curriculum is designed by faculty, it is done so by being informed by our partners and employers that we work with. So the knife crime example is a good one. We've been consulting with the Met Police to really understand what that complex problem looks like from a perspective of an organization like the Met. So, and if you incorporate that in the curriculum from the very kind of like from the very first days, I think that really gives students exposure to what real world problems look like. It also gives an opportunity to build a network, as I put out there as well, multiple touch points to engage with employers and outside organizations. So not just one internship maybe during their studies, or not just kind of towards the end of their degree, go to a couple of careers fairs or things like that, but really incorporated in a much more holistic way, talks by employers, site visits, co-curricular activities, in addition to what I just said, kind of like using employer expertise in the curriculum. And that kind of links to the point around career services. Career services traditionally have very much set kind of like at the periphery a little bit of universities, and students could find it, but usually the students that are already quite savvy are the ones that are able to actually tap into that as a resource, and that leaves behind some of the students from lesser privileged backgrounds as well. So we really believe that career service should be much more of an integrated part of the university or of the student experience at university, and that there should be continuous mentoring and coaching and professional development programming available for students throughout their journey with the university. And students should be really actively encouraged and assigned a mentor to help them through that and navigate that aspect of their futures. And then the last bit is obviously perhaps a bit of an obvious one, internships, but as I said, internships are often a one-off occasion. At LAS, we are building a model where students do an internship at the end of every year. But with the world changing as it is, and with kind of the challenges that COVID has also imposed on us, we need to be very creative in the way that we're looking at internships. Perhaps the traditional internship, as we all know it, is not something that is easily replicable, or at least not to the extent that it has been. So we need to look at things like virtual internships, but also project-based internships that students work on remotely, and kind of rethink the way that we can insert internships into the university experience. So that's me done. I just wanted to conclude by saying also, based on what Felix was saying about Black Lives Matter and diversity in kind of like graduate recruitment, that obviously goes for university recruitment as well. LAS, another thing that makes LAS very different from other universities is that we have developed an admissions model that's based on contextual admissions. So we don't look at grades, we look at grades only within the context of the student's background. So we look at the school that they've gone to, whether or not they are on free school meals, what their parents' financial situation is, are they carers, etc. And we invite every student to a selection day where we assess them based on their skills and interview. Obviously now with COVID, we are working on developing an online model for that, but the hope is really to attract a large amount of BAME students and to really increase diversity in a sector that is still sadly very much dominated by privilege in some extent. So yeah, that's me, and these are my details here. I'm happy to answer any questions, and also if you're interested in knowing more about us and perhaps becoming one of our partners, I'd be delighted to have a conversation and love to hear from you. So yeah, I'll stop here. I'll also stop sharing my screen. Felix, you're on mute.
There we go. Classic. That's another real Zoom problem. Marielle, thank you so much. That was unbelievably interesting. Really good. Boy, did I get the running times wrong. Sorry about that for everyone that had anything waiting. But I, for one, thought it was well worth the waiting for that, Marielle. That was really interesting, and the work that you guys are doing at LIS is fascinating. I really do think you guys are going to change the sector, and I would encourage anyone that's looking at their diversity, their early careers intake to drop Marielle a note, because I know that they're doing some really interesting stuff, and welcome further participation. Well, that's it for today. Last thing to say, we've got a webinar that I didn't mention, which is around driving diversity in your organization. It's actually this Thursday at 11 a.m. So we will send the registration link for that around in the summary email from this. But thank you so much for joining. I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys did as well, and have a really good rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Marielle.